Little Johnny Chronicles number 12. This is the Troll Series 7.0. So this is I think the 8th installment of the Troll Series. Again, we're outlining some of our what I'll call deviant behavior, dark behavior. I'm outlining the different trolls in our lives, the different ways that we participate as trolls in other people's lives, and inject or insert unnecessary, unrequired, negative activity, negative feedback, just being a general pain in the fucking ass for no good reason. That's why I named it the Troll. I think everybody can relate or understand exactly what that might mean, what's implied, etc. Today we're going to talk about unions. But before we talk about unions, I want you to think of your top 3 goals in life or your priorities. And if this show has nothing to do with that, you should probably go do that. And I recommend it. If not, if you have the time to hang out with me, appreciate it. Let's get started. Unions. So I have a couple stories first. I don't have a lot of experience with unions. Of course, all I know is a media narrative, but I do have some personal stories related to it. So back in the day when I was a youngster, I heard the adults. I come from a little town. I was raised in a little town called Greeley, Colorado. I moved there from Los Angeles, California when I was 11. And what happened is, when I got there, there was still the story about one of the local meatpacking plants. There's several up there in Weld County. That's the county that Greeley is located in Colorado. And of course, in those types of institutions, the union is prevalent. There's a huge labor force. I think a union might be a good idea in those locations. However, here's the story. I used to hear frequently about how the union would try to get into the meatpacking plant. And at that time, and probably still, they were the biggest employer in the county, specifically in the city of Greeley. Well, with that, I had a few uncles that worked in that meatpacking plant, and the union was always trying to get in there. What's the motivation for the union to enter a workplace? Well, union dues. I kind of see the union as a middleman between the employee and the employer, and maybe it's appropriate if the union is acting in good faith. And what tends to happen is, you pay your union dues, and then there's a dispute between the union and the employer, and sometimes the employer simply doesn't want to, or maybe business-wise, doesn't think that having a union in between them and the employee is a good idea. It's not cost efficient. And I don't know the math in that equation, but I assume that a business might know better. Typically, operating with the union for a business is an increased cost because they advocate for employee salary, benefits, disputes, all that kind of stuff. And of course, the union is advocating on behalf of the employee, or at least they're supposed to. And what happened back then was that finally the union was able to get into the meatpacking plant. And of course, not every employee was a fan of it. However, once they have enough employee support, they get voted in. And of course, you have the union representing those people. And what they found was that the meatpacking plant made more money by shutting down than staying open and having a union represent the employees at the time. I think this was in the early 80s. It's my best guess. Late 70s, early 80s. And so they shut it down. And everybody lost their job because the union was simply, quote unquote, demanding too much. Whether that's true or not, I don't know. What I do know is true is that I had an uncle who lost his job, and because of that lost his house. And it was all because the union was able to get into the company, and they had a foothold. And I don't know what the catastrophe was, but it caused everybody in that meatpacking plant to lose their job. Of course, until they reopened operations again several years later. Of course, they hired everybody back. Not everybody, but they hired people and they got the workforce back. When we moved there in 1987, that's the first place my mom started working. She worked there for a long time, and in her time there, again, the union tried to wedge their way in, and it took them a long time to do that, but they did. And I was able to hear the story from a mom's perspective, from an employee who worked in the organization, while the union was representing the employees there. And her common complaint, her consistent complaint, was that because of the union, it was hard to get people to do work. It was hard to get them to do overtime. Anytime you try to write somebody up for a legitimate infraction, or you try to give them a legitimate write-up for an infraction, the union would step in and say no. And of course, when it came time for raises and et cetera, working under the union, she said was horrendous. And I'll give her the benefit of the doubt simply because she worked there for several years without a union. And then after the union, she said that's when all the problems started. So are unions good or bad? The only other experience I have with unions, and this is a movie I saw when I was really, really young, so I could be misremembering stuff, but I don't think so. It was a movie about either the late 70s or early 80s, and it was a trucking company. And in the movie, again, right, the employees were looking for better wages, et cetera, and they went on strike. And, I don't really see a problem with that, but as I was watching the movie and watching the scene unfold, the people were out there, striking, and the union representatives would show up in the limousine and get out with their umbrella and stand with the union workers. And then, of course, once it came quitting time, they would have their limousine pick them up, and then they would leave. And of course, the striking employee was still out there because, they're striking 24/7. And it left a bad taste in my mouth because the union is collecting dues on behalf of the employee. In my opinion, everybody in the C-suite of the union should be out there with the employees striking, right? Because the union is typically the one to call for or demand the strike. And so, anytime I hear of a union spoken of, at least on the personal level, I don't see people have good experiences with it. I'm not saying that a union isn't helpful, because I could definitely see how having an organization advocate on behalf of the employee is a good thing, because there's such a thing as greedy companies. We see it now, right? They don't give a fuck about us, the environment. There's all kinds of chemicals and microplastics leaching into our bodies through food and the air and all that shit, because the companies don't give a fuck. They don't give a fuck about Mother Earth, who actually provides the milk and honey of survival. So I don't give companies a whole lot of leeway here. But also the union, in my opinion, is a type of company. It definitely does serve as a type of corporation, because once it gets big enough, it has a large structure similar to a corporation. And you have the presidents and all those people embedded who are supposedly advocating and organizing the union to support the employee, but they're getting a paycheck. And I just tend to think that's kind of a conflict of interest. Not kind of, very much so a conflict of interest. So are they always working in the employee's best interest? I don't know, but again, in my personal experience, I don't think so. So what is the union? The union is probably falls into the category of let's nest it, right? So the union itself is a troll, or can exhibit troll behaviors, but it's an antiquated or legacy system, or legacy organization, and that simply implies that they don't keep up with the times. It's time to reform that type of institution, to catch up with the modern way of living, the modern type of employment. And my contention is that they simply need to reform. So they simply need to develop a new way of labor and skill management. If you look across the broad cross-section of employment today, it's not the same as the 60s, 70s, 80s, or even the 90s. Employees tend to be more hip to their rights. Employees tend to understand what they need to do. In my opinion, the A lot of the jobs are a lot more complex and technical, even on the labor side. So it just makes sense that the employee should be getting paid more at this point, especially with uh, the inability of the corporations to continue to pay employees the proper pay to keep up with inflation. We know that they're not meeting that threshold. However, the employer, the American consumer, the citizen, definitely always suffers from the inflation and the degradation of wages compared to that inflation. And so, of course, it reduces their buying power. Taxes are crazy right now, so that continues to erode the take-home pay of the employee. Meanwhile, every single sector, whether it be energy or technology or whatever you have it, continues to record profits. So that simply means is that they're not applying the the philosophy that we're going to help the employee keep up with inflation. We're going to help to boost up their paycheck, or help their paycheck keep up. Matter of fact, we're going to share in the reward of their labor, because at the end of the day, without the employee, the corporation doesn't have shit. I think the revolt, or kind of like the, what do you call it? Having the torches and the shovel and the pickaxe. I think employees need to start showing up to work like that en masse. If the union is serious, I think they would do something like that, because just from what I've seen, the corporation has developed into a hydra. They're a seven-headed monster of not give a fuck. And they tend to chew up employees and spit them out as if they're garbage. The example I have is, same thing, right? The meat packing plant where my mom used to work. She gave about 22 years, kind of like me, right? I gave 22 years of service in the Army, and that shit was hard. I think of how hard my mom worked, and holy shit, I would rather do the Army for 22 years than go into that meat packing plant and bust my ass the way she did. At the end of the day, because her body degraded and it broke down so severely, she was unable to continue in the labor job that she was employed in. She had arthritis in her hands, bad knees. To date, she's had 2 knee replacements, and I think 2 hip replacements. Anyway, long story short, that type of hard and demanding labor breaks down your body, with really no pension, no 401k plan. At least in her day, they didn't have all of that stuff. And at the end of the day, when she got not hurt, but when she was unable to continue, they moved her to a different position. Okay, no problem. We're going to go ahead and slide you over into the office job, which really is their system to push people out of the organization, because it moved to an office job, to a recruiting job, to really where the employment and the pay wage was so intolerable that she just had to move on. So she dedicated her life to this organization, with the hope that, I guess, that she'd have a pension or something at the end. I really don't remember anymore. But at the end of the day, I think she got like a $10,000 check for 22 years of busting her ass. No union. I guess she decided not to join the union. Maybe it would have been helpful to her. But because it was so painful to work with unionized employees, she just didn't want to. It left a bad taste in her mouth, because why would she want to be associated with the lazy? And I'm not saying all union employees are lazy, but in that organization, that definitely was the case. Matter of fact, the employer was exploitative, because what happened was, at the time they had a huge and mass deportation issue, because a lot of the people that worked at the meat packing plant were illegals, and tells you a lot, right, about their morals and ethics. They're hiring illegals in mass. Well, once they had the deportation problem, they had a worker shortage. Well, how do we fix that? Well, also at the time, you had a big refugee influx, and I won't name the country, but they had a big refugee influx, and they said, well, we'll just hire them. Well, what do you get then? You get a unionized workforce that doesn't understand the culture, doesn't know the language, doesn't have the same work ethic as the deported employee. Those were Mexicans, I'll be clear. And so they got there and they just didn't function the same way. So as you can probably imagine, the new guy from a different country who doesn't understand the culture figures out what the union can do and actually helps them work less for more money. Because that's the philosophy, right? Like if you're new here, that's kind of what you're trained to think. And so it just made life a living hell. So, and my mom didn't get shit at the end. Maybe it's her fault, maybe not. But she showed up early. She stayed late. She worked, extended shifts. Definitely at a minimum 10 hours. Sometimes like 16, and sometimes 7 days a week. I don't know how she did it. I imagine that having 3 kids at home, demanding food, shelter, water, clothing, all that stuff was a huge motivator for her. But at the end of the day, her motivation wasn't rewarded with any type of equilibrium. It wasn't fair. Anyway, that's the way it works. So the union definitely has to reorganize. It has to reform. I have a bunch of notes related to the union, but I think that's enough. I think we can see very clearly that the union, even if it can serve a role for the employee, their function has stagnated. Very few industries that I know of have a union that works in concert with the corporation in lockstep, and they have a good relationship. An example would be the railroad. You get a railroad job, that's the shit. Lots of civilian type of employment are unionized. I think teachers, you could look at the teachers union, police, and we could argue whether or not any of those are good. In the case of the teachers, if you have a profession that requires a bachelor's and master's degree, in my opinion, teachers are some of the most educated employees on the planet. They require all this education before they can even step foot in the classroom, and then we don't want to pay them. They're with our children 8 hours a day. That's their job. And although the teachers are not our children's parents, unfortunately, because they're in such close proximity to our children for so many hours of the day, I think it's important that we have a vested interest that a teacher is happy, satisfied, not just that credentialed and competent and can do the job, but also is well compensated for all those efforts, fairly compensated. And, it depends on the state and the city and the county and all that stuff. But typically that's not the case. Of course, unless you live in a rich neighborhood. But, there you go. That's part of the problem. Anyway, we could talk about the police union. I don't think it's right that I do believe in representation for anybody, like the plaintiff and the defendant. The defendant always requires quality representation, fair representation, because the defendant is not always guilty. We are innocent until presumed. We are presumed innocent until found guilty. You have to prove it beyond a reasonable doubt, and frequently, the union interferes with the justice system because of the thin blue line, nepotism, the whole ball and caboodle. And people get upset when you say that. Well, I don't think anybody should be above the law. If you shoot somebody 85 times for having pulled out their wallet, that might be a fucking problem. I'm sorry, it's not 85. It was 42 times that they blasted that guy. Anyway, so you see kind of the issue with the union sometimes taking the advocacy for the employee to a degree which is not conducive to justice. And the police force is kind of an extension of the justice system. So it's just an oxymoron at that point. So anyway, you can kind of see how the union can be a big troll. And if you work for a union or you support the union, or if you're a unionized system that works, good for you. We definitely need organizations that are employee advocates, that understand the law and our rights way better than us employees can, because we don't give a fuck about that shit. We want to go work. You're hiring us for the skill or our labor. Give me the job. Tell me what I'm supposed to do. Compensate me fairly. But it's the unions that help us to understand when we're being abused, because sometimes we're like sheep. We put the blinders on. We get to work because we need that paycheck. Because like my mom, we have kids at the house who need to eat. They need to be sheltered. They need to be clothed. Beyond that, even if you don't have kids, you still have to pay rent. So if you have a union that supports you, that is quality, good for you. You have lucked out. If you're a fucking troll union, get your shit together. Learn from the unions that know what they're doing or having better success advocating for their employee. Do the right thing. Fucking unions. Troll. See you later.